Hello, good afternoon, and welcome to this RTS Lunchtime event series. This is on lockdown viewing. Welcome to all of you. I understand there's about 160 people in the room already, so thank you for coming today. I'm Kate Bulkley. In a prior RTS online session, we looked at the economic consequences of this pandemic, which have caused an unprecedented drop in TV advertising, and the lasting implications of which are obviously still to be played out. We don't really know. There's certainly no consensus on the shape of the recovery curve and how fast it'll happen. But in today's session, we decided it would be good to look at the viewing trends that we've seen in lockdown. What exactly are they? Which parts of the television space have they hit the most? SVOD, BVOD, linear. We're also going to look at some of the reasons behind these things that we think why this has happened, and some of them are obvious and some maybe are less obvious. We're also going to look a little bit into the future about whether some of these will actually continue and what might make them continue if we want them to continue, and what some of the sort of lasting consequences might be of how viewing has changed during lockdown. So as I said, I'm Kate Bulkley. I'm an independent media commentator, and I'm here to run this. Before I introduce our panel, who you probably can already see on screen, we have a format today, which is a 1-hour panel discussion. We have some slides to start from Barb, which will be great to set us up. They're going to sort of do a scene setter. We also have 2 polls, and we want you to vote in these polls. Please vote and then press submit. If you don't press submit, it doesn't disappear from your screen, so please do that. We also want your questions. You can put those into the Q&A bar, which is right at the bottom of the Zoom panel. I'm sure most of you are familiar with Zoom now. But anyway, put your questions in there. We're also recording this event, and it will be on the RTS website later if you want to catch up or review it. So let me introduce our panel. One of our panelists is actually not here yet, but I've been told she's on her way. So let me introduce you to the other ones first. Jonathan Thompson, he's the CEO of Digital UK. Digital UK is the organization that runs Freeview. We also have Martin Greenbank. He is the head of advertising, research, and development at Channel 4. Hi, Martin. We also have Justin Sampson. He's the CEO of Barb, the organization that delivers the UK's television audience measurement currency, sometimes referred to as the gold standard. The lady who's on her way, fingers crossed, is Rachel Shaw. She's head of content portfolio audiences at the BBC. So it's I think it's a good panel. And I think we can get a really good view of what's going on with viewing in lockdown. So Justin, if I could ask you to start off with some slides, that would be fantastic. Take it away, Justin Sampson.
Sure. Okay. So hopefully everybody can see the screen. I'm focusing on the lockdown period as defined by weeks 13 to 21 of 2020, and most of the information I'm going to share compares what happened in that lockdown period with the pre-lockdown period during 2020, so weeks 1 to 12. Although on these first 2 slides, I'm also comparing the lockdown period with the same period the previous year. So the first point to make, which I think has been well documented, is that people are spending much longer in front of TV sets, regardless of what they're doing. So we can see here in the lockdown period an average of 307 minutes, that's over 5 hours a day. And that is an increase of 18% on the pre-lockdown period and an increase of 1/3 on the equivalent period in 2019. And the amount of time we're seeing people spending in front of TV sets, it's the kind of levels you'd normally see at Christmas. It's the highest non-Christmas level since The Beast from the East, which some of you will remember as a freak weather from a couple of years ago. Not only are they spending longer in front of their TV sets, they're spending longer watching Barb reported channels. So this is the collective viewing to all Barb reported channels. You can see in the lockdown period in 2020, that's 240 minutes, just over 3.5 hours, an increase of 7% on pre-lockdown, an increase of 18% on previous year. In terms of the type of content they're watching, not surprisingly, there's been an increase in the number of people watching news programs, and this is true across all ages. So what we have here is for the different age groups from kids 4 to 15 on the left through to 65 plus on the right. You can see the average audience, the orange is lockdown, the blue is pre-lockdown, and there's significant growth in all demographics. What is also evident from this chart is the enormous amount of viewing of news programs that goes on amongst older people, and they still account for the vast majority of audiences, but there are some very encouraging growth figures in younger audiences. Another trend is more instances of people watching in groups. So this is the increase in what we call co-viewing occasions, again comparing the lockdown period of weeks 13 to 21 with the pre-lockdown period. And you can see that there's been a significant increase in groups of 2, 3 and 4 people watching together. So families, households are coming together and sharing their viewing in a way that they weren't before lockdown. We also need to highlight a very significant step change in what we call unidentified viewing. And just to be clear what that is, we know the TV set's on, but people aren't watching a Barb-reported channel. And within unidentified viewing, you'll have viewing to SVOD services such as Netflix and Amazon. You'll have viewing of things like YouTube, gaming, overseas satellite channels. And you can see here in looking at the left amongst all individuals, in the lockdown period, there's been an average of 90 minutes a day on unidentified viewing, and that represents just short of 30% of all TV set usage. And you can see that that is a significant step change on what was an increasing trend anyway. And we've also included in this chart 16 to 34-year-olds and 4 to 15-year-olds, and you could see how significant unidentified viewing is for these age groups, accounting during the lockdown period for well over half of all their TV set time. My last scene setting chart looks at how viewing has increased through the day. Just focusing first of all on Barb-reported channels, again comparing the lockdown period of weeks 13 to 21 with pre-lockdown. You can see how from 8:30 in the morning onwards, there's an increase in viewing levels to Barb-reported channels. There's a notable increase, I think, around lunchtime. And we know from other data we've looked at that that's people turning to the lunchtime news. And there is growth less significant during the afternoon, but then in the evening, again, there's a reasonably significant uplift compared to pre-lockdown. But it is worth contrasting that with what's happened to unidentified viewing through the day. And while this is at lower levels, you can see that the increase at all times of day compared to pre-lockdown is fairly significant. And I'd highlight 3 things. Firstly, if we look at the 8 to 10 o'clock slot, unidentified viewing at that time has grown by 46%, lockdown versus pre-lockdown. If you compare that with the Barb-reported channels, their increase is 5%. And to finish off, I'll just highlight the eagle-eyed amongst you might have noticed at 9 o'clock, there's a little, in the morning, there's a bump. And we do know that that's been caused by the Joe Wicks PE show on YouTube. And with that, I end the scene setting slides.
Great, thank you so much. I think Rachel's coming, but I can't quite see her yet, so we'll just hope that she gets into this. That was really helpful, Justin. Martin, can I just come to you right away? And, oh, there you are, Rachel. Hello, welcome. Rachel Shaw. Thank you for joining us. So Rachel, as I've already introduced you, Rachel, but you're head of content portfolio audiences for BBC. We just saw Justin's slides, and Martin, I was just coming to you to give us sort of your reaction to that. Obviously, there's been a lot of uptick in a lot of categories: news, younger people doing unmatched viewing. What is this? Is this the picture you recognize at Channel 4? What's the difference? Give us your feedback on what you.
Absolutely, yeah. We see a lot of that. Like all broadcasters, TV has become really important during lockdown, and it's an activity that fulfills a number of need states for people when they can't do other things. But it's also hugely important when it comes to things like information. And so the news, as you mentioned, news has gone pretty much through the roof for all audiences. To give you a sort of sense of perspective, it's a bit uneven as well, because as Justin's slides might have shown, you've got older audiences drawn to news. We've seen Channel 4 News doubling its reach against young audiences, 16 to 34s.
Doubling its reach.
Doubling its reach. So you end up with, for some audiences, the effects, the movements can be quite great. So for young audiences in particular, we've seen a complete resurgence of viewing back to linear, back to broadcast VOD, and of course, as you're seeing through some of that data, some of the SVOD services. Daytime, particularly strong for all broadcasters and us included, but peak as well. The interesting bits about peak is the kind of viewing they're doing. So a lot of established titles doing really well. So from our side, it's Gogglebox, Celebrity Bake Off, which were in the beginning of the lockdown window. Gogglebox is doing its biggest numbers it's ever done on both an overnight and consolidated. You've got something like Celebrity Bake Off, which is also doing its biggest numbers, over 6 million in audience. But then when you get the sort of new content, stuff that we had breaking, possibly quite well timed, things like Friday Night Dinner, the new series, breaking all the records that we have for comedy launching, and it's those kind of shows that can draw in the co-viewers, the young viewers, and the sort of more mass viewers that seem to be doing really well in peak. I come on.
These are new shows. These are new shows.
Yeah, well, some are new shows, some are old shows. Of course, all the broadcasters have had loads of reactionary pieces. I think we've had some 16s. They've reached.
Okay, you're starting to break up. I don't know if everybody else is seeing that, but
Enormous part of the game.
You've frozen. So, Martin, can you restate that?
Still got me?
I think so, yeah.
We've had some 16 documentaries around coronavirus, and it's reached 18 million people. So that's, 30% of the population.
Right.
So new stuff lands as well, but people are looking for entertainment. They're looking for a bit of relief, or at least they were at the start of the lockdown period. And the success translates over into the non-linear side as well. So we're seeing sort of uplifts of 30% in young audiences in peak on linear, but in VOD, we're seeing 50% plus in terms of viewing that's going there.
Is this in all four, or is this like on all four? Okay, so the competition from the Netflixes and the Disney Plus launch, have you felt that impact or not so much?
I think because everything's going up, and it's difficult to understand exactly what share everyone's getting of the additional viewing. Everyone of course is happy about how things are going up. It is disproportional on the non-linear though. So, but don't forget that the SVOD isn't the majority of that unmatched viewing. It's, from our estimates, it's between around 40 to 50% of that unmatched viewing number that Justin was presenting earlier. Okay. The rest is unmatched broadcast to VOD content, gaming, which has gone up quite a lot. The likes of listening to the radio or low volume stuff that can't be picked up by a barb. There's a lot of mishmash in that. Okay.
So really, it's all pretty good news. I mean, in terms of viewings up, particularly youngs for things like news and documentaries. So Rachel, if I come to you, is this the similar kind of situation you're seeing at the BBC across linear, across iPlayer? Give us sort of your view on some of these upticks. Audio. There you go.
Classic Zoom behaviour there. So for the BBC, we've seen record audiences in linear and also across iPlayer. So I think in terms of just in slides, you know, as you know, we're half in that linear world, and you'll be able to see BBC One audience share, but we're also in that unmatched world, because at least half of our viewing now in iPlayer is going into that unmatched bucket as well. So we're straddling both worlds. We've seen an increase in reach across the board. So people who weren't consuming the BBC have come back to the BBC on a weekly basis. And then we've seen a real increase in frequency, that people who came to us maybe once or twice a week are now coming to us on a daily basis. They're viewing more often within the day, and they're viewing for longer sessions. So we found with audience behaviour, there's an urgency and a frequency in terms of how they're coming back to the BBC. We've seen record-breaking audiences from, you know, Boris Johnson's address across the BBC. We've seen families watching content together. So as Justin said, this enormous rise in co-viewing. Historically, you might see that for big events, big sporting events, or big entertainment show finales. Actually, we are seeing massive co-viewing for the repair shop. We're seeing it for the Nest. We're seeing it for normal people or for big end shows. So across the board. And in terms of iPlayer, since lockdown, we've seen 1 billion iPlayer requests. Initially, in the first few weeks, a lot of it was driven by live viewing of the news, but actually once we got 3 or 4 weeks into lockdown, it was overtaken by drama. So Killing Eve and Normal People are now the main reason why people are coming to iPlayer. And I know we're going to talk later about habits. I think we're seeing habits, certainly those early weeks, being driven by, I think, people wanting the daily updates every day, a desperate need for updates from the government in the mid-afternoon. Then they wanted the BBC News in order to digest what they're hearing and seeing. Then we had a local news story, so people wanted to see how it was relevant to where they live, what it meant for them. And then we had this big break where everyone said, okay, the one show, we can all kind of absorb what's going on and feel more like a community again. And the warmth, I think, of the daily one show habit has been really beneficial to us. So we've had a kind of information curve mid-afternoon into early peak, where people have been driven back to BBC One in particular and BBC News, and then are exploring content into peak afterwards.
Isn't it interesting how when you get them in, you know, at access peak, they stay with you if they're in the set, which is always very interesting. You know, as we started to see the audience starting to fragment across platforms, if you can get them in, they will tend to stay with you if they think they're going to see something that's interesting. So I think that's something you've seen.
Yeah, so it's a massive opportunity for our schedules to work really well, to optimize schedules, but really good also for media planning, because we can cross promote throughout the BBC.
Yeah, it's almost like back to the good old days. Jonathan, let me come to you. You know, we've been hearing about younger viewers watching more PSB. Does this ring true with what you're seeing through Freeview, which obviously delivers a lot of this PSB audience? So talk us through.
Yeah, it does. I mean, it's actually, we've just sort of to build on what Justin presented and what Rachel and Martin have been talking about. We did some research in April, which was less looking at viewing behavior, it was looking at viewing attitudes, so people's attitudes to broadcasting. So this was sort of mid-April, so about a month into lockdown. And I think, I'll give you a few stats from it in a second, but the most interesting finding, I think, from the research was that the attitudes towards public service broadcasting in particular didn't really vary between the population as a whole and 16 to 34-year-olds. So there had been this narrative, I think, emerging that this generation, anyone under 30, had sort of completely disengaged with public service broadcasting. And I think both the viewing behavior during the lockdown and kind of the attitudinal evidence we're seeing in our research highlights that's not true. So just if I can, Kate, just a couple of stats just to give you just from the research we're publishing this week. A few that I thought were interesting. So in terms of, first of all, TV is still seen as the most important medium for information by all groups, so including 16 to 34 was ahead of the web or radio or newspapers. The PSB, so BBC, ITV and Channel 4 are amongst the top 4 most valued providers. It's worth noting that Netflix...
That's good, we have them both here. Yes, go ahead, sorry.
Netflix is in that top 4 as well, both for all audiences and particularly for 16 to 34s. So Netflix and the BBC basically are neck and neck amongst 16 to 34s. So it highlights, you know, Netflix is important. And then when it comes to kind of the role of public service broadcasting, again, amongst 16 to 34s in particular, 2/3 are saying that they're relying on the PSBs for news and information, that they trust them more than other providers. I think one of the most interesting stats for me was 62% of 16 to 34s say that they now value content from the public service broadcasters more than they did before the corona outbreak. That's actually higher than
62%.
62%. That's higher than the population as a whole, which is 56%. So
Wow.
there's some evidence, if anything, that it's sort of it's particularly resonated to younger audiences. And then the final stat is one that I would obviously care about, given what I do for a living, but 90% of 16 to 34-year-olds say that it's important that we have a sort of free TV service in this country. So the importance of universality and free access. So there are moderate variations for younger audiences. Clearly, Netflix is much more important to them than population as a whole. But it's striking how similar the patterns are, both the belief in public service broadcasting, its role, obviously that's backed up by the viewing behaviour, but that there's not much variation between younger audiences and the population as a whole.
So we're going to go to a poll in a second, but we've got two questions that have already come in. I think possibly Justin's the right person for this. It might also be Martin. Justin, what proportion of unmatched viewing is box sets or broadcast or VOD? Do you know that?
I don't have
Justin?
a precise number. I'm here. Yeah, I don't have a precise number. Sorry, Kate.
That's okay. Martin, do you have a?
Yeah, I think using sort of the data sets that are out there, like IPA touch points and the ThinkBox numbers, which they put together into that donut, you can calculate it, make a rough estimation of TV delivered broadcast of all, which is the vast majority of it. We've seen sort of 70-80% of our streams going onto a big stream. It's about 20%, 15 to 20% of that unmatched.
Does that sound right to you, Justin, from what you're thinking?
Well, we're just starting to get better insight into this. One of the initiatives we're working on at the moment is installing into our panel of homes a meter that is attached to the Wi-Fi router. And this gives us new capabilities that allow us to understand when there is unidentified viewing on a TV set, which internet delivered source is delivering that. And we're starting to get some really interesting insight. And the numbers aren't quite the standard that we would like. We still have got some open queries with Kantar, our supplier, on this, but we're hoping that will give us the ability to answer this question with great precision. It's just not an answer I can give you today.
Okay, so just really quickly, maybe to Rachel or maybe Martin again, if unidentified viewing is getting a bigger proportional uplift than linear, will that mean it will get a bigger share of the pie after lockdown? I mean, can we make those kind of assumptions or not? Rachel.
I think just going back to the point that within the unmatched viewing, we also have iPlayer viewing. So when we're doing a significant day one drop, so such as normal people, that will go into the unmatched bucket as well. So when we're looking from the BBC, we're looking at total TV across our linear channels and iPlayer, and to be able to look at audience needs across both platforms and across our portfolio of services. So we are hopeful that some of those changes will sustain, but we're in both sides, if you like. We're in linear and unmatched.
I also think that the SVOD side as well, what lockdown's done for them is just to reduce churn. So once lockdown starts to, we start to come out of it, there could be an expectation that actually churn will return for them because people start looking a little bit about the value exchange they're getting.
Right.
So not necessarily all good news for them.
Okay, good. Now we're going to run the first audience poll. So I'm going to ask Jamie to put that up. This is what's the most surprising viewing story to come out of lockdown? And hopefully it will come up on your screens. You've got a choice of 4. Here it is: the role and value of PSB, the rediscovery of linear TV, rise of SVODs, the rise of co-viewing. If you could vote on that and then please press submit, or you can't get rid of that poll off your screen and we don't know what you've done. So let's do that. While they're collating that, Justin, when you're thinking about the poll, what do you think is the part that will persist? In other words, what do you think will continue after lockdown of these? Is it going to be co-viewing? Probably not. I mean, I don't know. What's your opinion?
Well, I'd express a hopeful outcome, which is that young audiences do actually keep up this habit of relying on public service broadcasters for news. I mean, it's a conversation I've been having, forgive me for a sample of one story, but with my 23-year-old son about where do you get trusted news sources at a time like this? And I'm trying to help him understand the difference between an Australian website of unknown provenance and the BBC and Channel 4, which are regulated. So on a personal note, I would hope that out of this, young adults start to rely on services like the public service broadcasters for their news above and beyond social media and other online sources. So that's a personal expectation. I think the step change in unidentified viewing it's more significant than I think I would have estimated. From the data we're starting to see, we think the SVOD services have been instrumental in that. And I just wonder if there are all these new subscribers coming to SVOD services. As a new subscriber, there's no repeats on there, and if post lockdown there is, as people have suspected, said that there will be more repeats on the mainstream channels, then that might actually mean that some of the viewing that SVOD services have gained is kept by the SVOD services. So that would be a personal observation on that.
Right. Let me do the poll here. We've got the results. 84% responded. The results, it's clear win for linear TV rediscovery. So if you put that up, there we go. Yep, the red line there is 61% thinks the discovery of linear TV by younger audiences. I mean, that's interesting. What do you all think? I mean, one could be devil's advocate and say once they get out of the house and out of lockdown and they're back on their device, they may not be watching linear TV, even if it's in a BVOD on-demand format. I don't know. Rachel, what do you think? Do you think that...
I think there are a few things in there. One is, again, within the unmatched bucket, we've got gaming. So a lot of the young audiences are gaming through the TV set. So again, it isn't just Netflix. I think for us, it's a massive opportunity. Young people are coming back to the BBC in enormous numbers. So it's beholden to us to get our content right and be able to offer them content that is meaningful to them and is reflecting their lives. So sorry to interrupt you. Do you think that's one of the reasons why Tony Hall has said that you want to return BBC Three to becoming a linear channel and no longer just have it as an online channel? Is that part of this thinking? I think our thinking is audience first. So if we're going to be creating more content for younger audiences, to be able to look at all options available to us in order to deliver that in the most effective way. So, you know, a linear channel is a consideration for launching content and reaching lots and lots of young audiences. I think we'll be reviewing that decision later on in the year when we've seen how some of these behaviors settle down over time. But I mean, some of them, it'd be interesting to see what happens with working from home as a pattern. I think one of the implications for us is how daytime audiences are going to change. There are more ABC workers, younger workers who will probably do a kind of hybrid in the office working from home experience. So that'll change the shape of what content we might make available there. You know, thinking of BBC Radio, just thinking of drive time and commute times and how they may change as opportunities. So I think there'll be a number of things that we need to see how they settle down over the next few weeks or so.
Would you personally be a proponent of taking BBC Three and putting it back as a linear channel? I mean, do you think that makes sense? I mean, you're a cross-eye player, you know what's going on out there.
Well, I would look at the huge success of Normal People and see that the power of linear combined with iPlayer can be enormous. So we've got a BBC One primetime slot for Normal People, but it's also delivered 250,000 activations on iPlayer for us. So sometimes there's a real sweet spot of using both services together.
Yeah, okay. So Martin, I mean, what is it about PSBs in a time of crisis? I mean, we sort of, you know, all this viewing has gone up because, I mean, in large part because of lockdown. Why is that, and can we sustain it, I guess? What's your view?
Yeah, we actually went into field in the first 2 weeks of lockdown with quite a large sample, 1,200 people, talked to it at depth. We did a mixture of qual and quant. And it's interesting. It expands on Justin's sample of one. Actually, you find this view that, and it was pretty much uniform at the start of lockdown, that people wanted really trustworthy news sources. And when we ask questions like which type of, or which source of news will resonate with you, and which do you trust, 90% of the adult sample that we put TV as their number one. And they were, and when they start to sort of look at what else is important, newspapers are also important, but way down the list is Facebook.
Well, that's good to know.
Yeah, the social platforms. And at the time, remember this survey was done. It's available on our Full Sales website if anyone wants to take a look. We asked about fake news at the time, because there were a few stories starting to circulate at the time, and more than 50% of the young people that we spoke to came back and said that they were aware of fake news stories circulating predominantly on social platforms. And that's one of the reasons they drive back to the PSBs, because they do recognise that it's regulated and there are reliable, credible sources that are being used. I've got this little quote that came from one of our respondents that sort of sums it up. She put it as, news sources like the BBC, Channel 4, Sky and ITV have a responsibility to report accurate news stories and have a history of reporting trustworthy news. So it's this familiarity with the fact that we've been doing it for years that has partly given the credibility back to
That's really interesting. And Rachel would probably reiterate what you were just saying about news. So Rachel, can I ask you a different question? Because we've got a couple of questions from the audience about this. In terms of repeats, how long is this sustainable? I guess what they're trying to get to is, if we talk about the resurgence of PSBs and linear viewing that we have been talking about, what about repeats and reruns? We're going to get into that pretty quickly now. And so is that going to be a roadblock to continuing this appetite, this renewed appetite for PSB content?
It's going to be a tricky balancing act for sure. Everyone knows we reduced EastEnders to 2 times a week. We're coming near to the end of that. I think we're having very creative discussions about how you keep things on air, how you keep things going. I think every week that lockdown gets a little bit tweaked, it offers more opportunities for us to get back to filming. I think for us more broadly around the response to PSBs, I think because obviously we're here to entertain audiences, but also because we're here to support them and reflect their lives. There's many different things we're doing across all our services that are responding to audience needs. So, if the one show is offering this amazing connectiveness and warmth and friendliness every day, on the other hand, we're offering Bite Size and iPlayer to help with homeschooling. And I think for, our latest polls with how parents are coping from home, at least half feel they're really, really struggling, finding it hard to work from home and do homeschooling at the same time. So I think if we're able as the BBC to offer universality in terms of homeschooling and lessons either through iPlayer or through linear TV, that's a really, really important service that the PSBs can give to people. I think beyond that, for younger audiences and how some of this may continue, I think we're seeing a resurgence of trends in craft generally. So whether it's the repair shop, that was a daytime show that, again, as Martin's saying, sometimes a program can have a moment to shine, and the repair shop was suddenly there at a time that everyone was craving warmth and compassion. And I think, we've had incredible audiences of 7 million for Repair Shop week in, week out. We've seen younger audiences come to Sewing Bee. We've moved it from BBC 2 to BBC 1. So we're looking at how we use all our inventory across all the BBC channels to maximise audiences. So sometimes where you may have had a gap for BBC 1, we can utilise content from BBC 2 or BBC 4. We can use BBC 4 content on BBC 2. So we can look at how we showcase and window content across our portfolio.
So really, you're getting into the scheduling and you know, figuring that out. It's interesting because that used to be a much more important part. I mean, I remember a couple of years ago starting to write stories about the end of the scheduler.
Yeah.
You know, why did we need that? Because, you know, so it's interesting how that's.
We've spent the last year talking about the long-term value of content and to measure performance over 12 months. And then the last 6 weeks saying, well, how did we do last night? So I think we're doing three things. We are optimizing the schedule here and now, and that's a great big military effort. Then we're doing a kind of agile commissioning. What can you do as permissions get greater, and what can you bring back? And then we are still absolutely focused on our strategic goals, which is about long-term value of content and is about using linear portfolio in conjunction with iPlayer on-demand services.
Yeah. So Jonathan,
everything busier.
Yeah, everything's busier, right? Jonathan, from your perspective, I mean, what do you see about how PSB can kind of keep this going? In other words, do you think that, what are the hurdles to you know, not having this sustained as we come out of lockdown and we have, you know, the rise of not as much content available and people start moving around more and maybe young people are back on their devices?
Yeah, no, I mean, I suppose the way I look at it is there were already underlying challenges to the model of public service broadcasting in this country that existed before the coronavirus came along, and they haven't gone away. And to your earlier question, I think, you know, that Netflix and Amazon will benefit from this to a certain extent, and Disney Plus, because people have got just more exposure to the idea of watching SVOD. But I think a positive from the last 3 months has been that it's sort of reminded us all what public service broadcasting is there for. I mean, I think we've had 20 years of policy wonks, including myself, trying to work out what's its role and what's its purpose and how do we measure it. We've had a really good case study of what's the purpose of public service broadcasting. What does it do? Why do people value it? What role does it play in their lives? And I think that the simple answer to your question in a way is that I hope all the PSBs, and we're certainly trying to apply this within Freeview really, remind themselves of what the importance is of their organizations to viewers, where they are better than Netflix, where they're better able to respond. I think one example, just to build on that, one of the things I think the PSBs have done brilliantly, I would say this given they're my shareholders, but one of the things they've done brilliantly is highlight that ability to respond quickly to events and to feel live and connected and part of the community, which it's very hard for a Netflix to do as a global broadcaster. And it's hard for a Sky to do, to be fair. I mean, Sky News has been brilliant, but Sky as a platform is not really there to do that. It's there to provide sport and entertainment. And so I think the PSB's, the secret, I think, to...
Well, the people who work for Sky News might dispute that, but yes.
No, and I did, to be fair, I did say Sky News played a vital role, but Sky as an organisation as a whole, its wider output is there for live sport and entertainment and things like that. So
I think that's why they're a little worried about Amazon offering Premier League games for free when they come back. But anyway, go ahead.
Premier League alone is a very interesting experiment in the future of broadcasting. That's probably one for another panel. But my broad point is, what I would say to the PSBs in a way is take the lessons from this of what really connects with audiences. As Rachel said, you know, audience first. You've sort of highlighted why you're so important, and continue to do that really, regardless of how long the coronavirus goes on for.
Yeah. Why don't we go to audience poll 2, I think, which is, which of the viewing trends seen in lockdown is most likely to continue? And there's a second part to this one, by the way. Which of these trends is least likely to continue? So we started talking about that a bit on the panel. So if you all at home could vote on that, that would be fantastic. And don't forget to press submit, otherwise it will not be logged. So while that's going on, Martin, we talked about broadcasters moving into BVOD in a big way, broadcaster VOD. Is the lockdown data telling you something different about where to put your money and resources going forward? I mean, how do you balance, I guess Rachel will have a view on this too, she talked a little bit about it already, but how do you balance the linear and the BVOD side of the business?
They're never one or the other. That's the first thing. And you think about the programming content that can travel the best between the two. You know, our view about young audiences was increasingly putting digital broadcaster VOD first, or social channels, to try and entice them into the brand. Lockdown sort of done us a massive favor, and it's brought in a huge amount of young audience that had not been frequently coming to us. But when you get some examples of programming that has really travelled well, it's 10 years plus now since the Inbetweeners first aired, and it's done the rounds. It's been on all four, or 4OD back then, now all four, pretty much all the way through. And in my 6 years at Channel 4, it's been pretty much in the top 10, top 15 of content consumed week in, week out on all four. And that's not the same young people. 10 years ago, the young people are now slightly older, and so it's we're bringing in new lots of audience the whole time. So
you're bringing a new audience with old rope, is what you're saying.
Yeah, exactly. But it's not just the Inbetweeners, it's Dairy Girls. Comedy's really good at doing this because it just lives on. So Friday Night Dinner did have some of its series had a stint on Netflix, not by our own design, but production companies doing that. And that actually boosts our own viewing. This is a really interesting thing. It boosts our own viewing of Friday Night Dinner, even when you put it on Netflix. So I think
is the idea for you then to think, well, lean into comedy that you can then run, let's say multi-episodic comedy that you can then run on BVOD?
It just seems to live a long time. And if we can make stuff that works a bit like the BBC did with Normal People, made stuff that is produced through BBC Three, and then it gets a linear audience as well. It's a win for everyone. You want to get the biggest audience possible for your content. And if it starts in digital and then goes on to linear, or if it starts in linear and then has its main audience on digital, it doesn't matter. As long as we maximize the time that we can get viewers to spend with our content, that's what counts.
Okay. So the poll, they tell me, is in. It's closed. 70% voted, less than last time. Tight results, according to the RTS. First part, most was the rise of SVOD. I think we're going to start to see it on our screen. And the second part is, the least, is the rise of co-viewing. So the viewing trend seen that's most likely to continue will be SVODs, according to our audience. And the least likely to continue will be the rise of co-viewing. Right. Looks like the next one after that is discovery of linear. That's interesting. Okay. So Rachel, when you look at that, I mean, do you have a reaction to that? Or I know that there was something else about, how do PSB audiences feel about watching together? I mean, is there safety in that? Is there comfort? You talked a little bit about the one show as being kind of a warm embrace, but I mean, do you think that these trends are the ones that are going to stick?
I think there's a logic. It's entirely logical to say that some of the co-viewing will go down as perhaps more and more of us leave home and go back to work, and so that would make sense. I think what drives co-viewing though is part circumstance and part need. That actually being able to watch stuff with other people together is a really, really pleasurable experience. I think to build on Martin's point though, because we are looking across our own on-demand services and linear TV, we're also seeing warmth through nostalgia and people revisiting the back catalogue of content. So for us, Waterloo Road is an absolute star performer on iPlayer. It came back to us, I think, last September. And it's doing enormous numbers at the moment. And I think it delivers because you've got 100+ episodes. You can go there beginning series 1. It's massively skewed towards 16 to 24s, reliving their school days, and provides a real kind of warmth and emotional connection. I think one of the things that the SVOD players have taught us is that, and particularly in these moments of high anxiety, is there is sometimes a pleasure in revisiting old series. And known outcomes and the warmth of knowing that there will be a happy, pleasurable ending to a show can be really powerful. So I think
particularly in times like these, right? I mean,
exactly. So I will, if I need a bit of Friends, then I know where to go to. But similarly for Waterloo Road, that does a job.
It's no longer Netflix, right?
In the UK, it's anyway. But again, for comedy as well, we're seeing for young people, for comedy, we can get series where 70-80% of consumption is on iPlayer versus linear. We're doing more and more. We've doubled the amount of day one drops that we do year over year in the BBC. So that is
double them.
the amount. So we make content available on a BBC channel and we release it all for your viewing pleasure on iPlayer at the same time. Right. And we know this is incredibly important for younger audiences. They are very unruly in their behavior. They'll come pre-TX, they'll come post-TX. They just don't necessarily want to come at the time you're putting it out on a linear channel. Right. But the two in combination can be really, really effective.
So either Justin or maybe Martin, but maybe start with Justin, you know, we've got a lot of other SVOD services waiting in the wings. I mean, not only have we had a stunning launch of Disney Plus in this country, but we've also had, you know, Peacock is coming, HBO Max is coming. They're just, you know, they're going to keep coming at us. Do you think that the market can sustain all these services or not? Either Justin or Martin. I don't know if Justin has a view.
Well, I'll kick off on that. I think if they have the content and people want the content, then they will be successful. And just to build on the points that Martin and Rachel have made, we have seen data from the United States, which shows that on an ongoing basis, about 10% of Netflix's audience is down to 3 ongoing programs. It has been Friends, it's been The Office, and it's been Grey's Anatomy. And this is why Netflix made a big decision to go out and get Seinfeld when it lost Friends to Peacock, I think is right. But I think that if people have the content and people watch them, then viewers will come. It all comes down to the quality of the proposition, I think. And if you do have some good series like that as the bedrock on which to build initial interest in your shows, and I think Disney clearly has an amazing back catalogue of material. I suppose one question is how often are they going to be able to put new content up which keeps people viewing on a regular basis, and that's to be seen. That would be my observation.
I think there's a period of consolidation coming as well. I don't think it's sustainable for consumers to consider let's go from 2 SVOD services to suddenly 6. They notice when money's going out of their account, and the fact that you can churn off these quite readily and actually follow the content, dip in for the content you want, dip out when you've watched it. I think that's going to be really important. And these businesses aren't built, well, businesses like Netflix, they're built on a debt mountain. You know, that relies on the debt being serviceable in a longer term. And I'm not sure the global economics of this are going to support some of these businesses in terms of spending like loss leaders on their SVOD services without a good return.
It's interesting because today Ender's Analysis just came out with a report that said even though all platforms have experienced growth during lockdown, the report says streaming has proportionally had a greater uplift than live and catch up. And they think that post-COVID, this muscle memory, I like that term, this muscle memory should hand the likes of Netflix the inertia to take a bigger share of the available viewing pie than prior to the pandemic. Discuss.
PSBs are free. Let's not forget that when you're asking consumers to dip into their pockets during lockdown, it seems a lot of people's lives are affected because they've got loads of extra time. People are unfortunate enough to suffer from lack of economic, they've been affected economically, loss of jobs. That is going to get materially worse over the next few months. And people look at what they spend their money on. I think PSBs will become as important to them as they have been during the start of the lockdown because of that. And I think they will start to question what they do spend their money on because it will be a more scarce resource than it was in the past. So I doubt it's all good news for the SVOD players.
Jonathan, can I bring you in here? There seems to be a question here. During the economy session that I mentioned at the top that we had the other week, the PSBs were voted as the losers out of all this. So what's wrong with the funding model in your opinion? Is there something wrong with the funding model?
The funding model for public service broadcasting? Blind.
You don't know, right? That was a hard one. This audience is tough, Jonathan. What can I do?
Well, I think there's two parts to that, really. I mean, there is kind of the future of the license fee, which I've made a career decision of trying to avoid.
Probably wise.
I mean, clearly, there is a debate coming on the license fee, and then one's view of the sort of the recovery of the TV advertising market, on which I'm, hopefully Martin would thank me for saying this, I'm fairly positive. I think it's clearly very tough at the moment, but I hope it will come back fairly quickly. But to the wider question, I mean, I think if the underlying question is, does PSB continue to be able to play a role? Should it play a role? I think the answer to that is clearly yes. In a way, though, my earlier points were sort of highlighting that's what Corona has demonstrated, its importance. I think there are big policy questions about the how. How do we have a system of public service broadcasting that's sustainable and economically fundable? But I don't think it's unsolvable. I think the answers are there, and hopefully now we've got a government who recognise its importance compared to the government perhaps we had before the coronavirus, who just seem to be in the game of just bashing up the BBC at them. So I'm pretty positive about PSB and its future. I think the biggest thing that's needed is sort of for the kind of the direction of travel we've been on to continue in terms of collaboration, working together, recognising that SVOD is not going away. It's going to become a permanent feature of the market. But that was the case before the coronavirus. It's probably been nudged forward, but there are natural audience advantages and strategic advantages for staff. One of the most important is live. Linear is not a bad thing for PSB. It's absolutely vital to its health and future because it's the thing that Netflix don't have.
Yep. No, it's true, live. And also I think it also is about the digital divide too. As you said, PSB is free. And that, as Martin has pointed out, that's an important thing. There's only so much money people want to shell out for a variety of SVOD services. Rachel, if I can just come to you, we're coming near sort of the end of our session here. So one of the things we wanted to get to was, if we're going to sustain these levels of viewing, how should you approach things going forward? You talked a little bit about that, but is commissioning going to have to radically change, do you think? Are there things that you're doing differently? I mean, we talked a little bit about how obviously the production curve is going to take a while to reignite, if you see what I mean, and get that up and running again. I noticed even today, the BBC announced an archive-based re-edit of Total Wipeout. And Jack Whitehall, I guess, is doing something where he sits outside of his dad's front door to celebrate. So I mean, is commissioning going to change, do you think?
I think there's going to be a balancing period. As I say, at the moment that we're optimizing what we've got now, the agile commissioning are the kind of commissions that you're talking about at the moment, which is what can you make that is entertaining with all the restrictions currently in place. So reversioning archive is an excellent way of doing that and getting extra value. I think in terms of one moment for me that really struck me, though, that kind of thinks some things will be universal, we'll come back to, is when we first saw the marketing trails for Killing Eve on air. 1 second. Okay.
If you're a child in distress, please stop.
Wanted some homeschooling. So Killing Eve, the trails come on air, and it's like this most vivid, brilliant, colourful, exotic, different world, the tone of voice, the attitude, everything about it, and you kind of go, that's telly that I absolutely love, that premium quality, provocative, a bit naughty, a bit risky. And I think in a way those kind of shining moments will be drawn towards. So I think being bold and commissioning Normal People has been a fantastic success for us. So trying to think of those unique, distinctive voices and how you bring them to life in those kind of national moments.
Mm-hmm. That'll be big. What about you, Martin? Do you think, I know you're not on the commissioning side, but what do you think is going to change going forward? What trends would you like to see sustained, and how can Channel 4 help make that happen?
Well, Channel 4 has always been at the forefront of innovation when it comes to sort of adapting to how audiences are changing, or how the tastes or the reflecting the diverse cultures of the UK. So I don't see it as it's more of the same for us. This is just more of an accelerated change in one way. I guess that budgets are going to be an issue as we're ad funded. We've taken the raw end of the downturn in terms of advertising. However, that, as Jonathan said, that is coming back. It's coming back. It's yet to be seen how strongly it will come back and how quickly, but it's definitely not. It's not as cataclysmic as some of the projections that we're saying. So
yeah, well, some people are saying it's not going to be this kind of a curve, a V curve. It's going to be more of a swoosh. So a
Well,
gentler recovery. So we'll
I
see.
think it's coming back. It's coming back fairly fast now. So that's looking more like a V than anything else. In terms of what it's leading to is that advertisers who have the money, actually what they're trying to do is trying to get near the content itself. So we're seeing some really interesting interest now in an upsurge in AFPs, advertiser funded programming. We see a lot of the talent that's out there in terms of commissioning being much more flexible and wanting to try different things. So I think it's reset the commissioning and the advertising side of the businesses. And then now everything is being looked at as an opportunity rather than people are sort of looking at it as trying to protect or make small tweaks to. But budget is definitely going to be an issue going forward. So we're no longer the case of trying everything and hoping we find something. There's going to be some much smarter thinking up front before things get commissioned.
Yeah. Justin, there's one question for you. We're almost going to close down here, but I have a quick question for Justin that's come in from the audience. Is there a role here for Barb in terms of SVOD measurement? Will Netflix join Barb?
Absolutely. I mean, clearly we're not close to commissioning, but we've always prided ourselves on delivering to the people who do make those commissioning decisions a very comprehensive measurement of what people are viewing. And it doesn't give us any pleasure to be able to say that we can't be precise about what 29% of TV set time is being used for. And we have for many years had a challenge out with the research agencies that we work with to say, how can you help us provide better measurement of this unidentified viewing? And I mentioned earlier that we're attaching meters to the Wi-Fi routers, and that's giving us already some insight into aggregate levels of viewing to these services. But I think, I mean, if I were a commissioner, what I would want... Yeah, but I would imagine what the broadcasters really want is not just which service they're watching, but which programs are they watching. And that, I think, is a big gap that we can fill. And it's one we're in the final stages of a conversation with Kantar, which is, we hope, going to result in us commissioning a solution they've put forward, which will allow us to also deliver program level viewing for these services, even if they don't want to participate in Barb, although we do know there is some interest from Netflix about potentially joining in at some point.
That's interesting. All right. So final thoughts here from Jonathan, Martin, and then Rachel before we wrap up. Jonathan, what are your final thoughts? Is PSB, what's the prospects for PSB post-lockdown? Are you relatively optimistic? Do you think that there's a lot of work?
Sorry, Kate. I'm more positive about the future of public service broadcasting than probably if you'd asked me that question 6 months ago, despite the very challenging period it's clearly gone through. I mean, one point I haven't made, I just want to quickly touch on is, we talk about SVOD and the growth of connected viewing. Most of us are spending our lives on Zoom. There's still a big proportion of this country, 20% of this country, who barely use the internet. And for them, BBC, ITV, Channel 4 are basically their main means of communication with the outside world, particularly in a time like this. So the word that I think is important to all of this is universality, equal access, free, to Martin's earlier point. That notion has never been more important. And I think we were all a bit beguiled by the nature of paying $5.99 for our telly, and that was kind of the future. I think we've really highlighted how free is the future for a lot of our underlying public service broadcasting system. So
good thought. That's a good thought. That's great. That's great. Martin.
Kate, will you forgive me? I need to leave a bit early.
Okay, Justin, if you have to leave, thank you so much.
Thank you.
Ciao. We're almost wrapping up here. Thank you.
I agree with that, Jonathan. I saw a tweet earlier that I responded to someone commenting about, do people really watch live TV anymore? And it's that sort of that bubble that sometimes people can get caught up in, that your own behaviour, particularly if you work in media in London, you're not going to be reflective of the general population. I think we've got so many things coming back now onto TV that will make it more interesting, sport being one of them. That will, it will be fascinating to see what happens with Premiership football when there's no one actually watching it in the stadia and it's only available on TV. I'm not even a football fan, but I am fascinated by what's going to happen there.
What's going to happen? No, you're right.
As we represent BT Sport, I'm also quite thankful that's happening as well. So,
the football's coming back. That's right. Co-viewing, not in the stadium.
Yeah.
Okay, Rachel, what's your last remark? You know, what do you think? Are you relatively positive about this? There are a lot of work ahead.
Yeah, there's a lot of work ahead, but I would concur with universality, free, live. They are tremendously important, and we shouldn't diminish them anywhere. I'd add to that local. Local is really, really important. Hearing voices outside of London, and I think, you know, understanding local behaviours, local viewpoints is a point of distinction against, say, Netflix or Amazon that the BBC can take advantage of.
Great. So thank you all to our panelists, including Justin, who's left, but thank you to Jonathan Thompson, to Martin Greenbank, and to Rachel Shaw. I also want to a shout out to my producers who've been really great, Liz Reynolds, Keith Underwood, and from the RTS, Jamie O'Neill, who's been running the Zoom. Thank you very much to all three of you. They've been talking to me, fielding your questions through, so that's been really helpful. Also, thank you to the audience for attending and for your questions. I have to announce a couple of upcoming sessions on June 9th. Are you staying safe and well? It's looking at mental health in the time of COVID and beyond. And on June 11th, the RTS is also putting on a talk with Fran Unsworth. She is obviously the Director of News and Current Affairs at the BBC, and she'll be talking about news, which of course is something we've spent quite a bit of time on today. So please tune in for those. With that, I'm Kate Bulkley. Thank you for attending this RTS lockdown viewing session, and we all wish you a very pleasant afternoon. Thank you very much.